Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the ninth in our series of lectures, The Art of Relationships, focusing on individual artists represented in creative exchanges, the exhibition currently on view at the Pollock-Krasner House. I want to thank Victoria Pilato, Stony Brook University's digital projects librarian, for co-hosting this series, which is made possible by a generous gift from Dorothy Lichtenstein and Stony Brook's John H. Marburger III Memorial Fund. And I want to welcome one of our online participants, Teresa Davis, who is the co-curator of the exhibition. She's with us this afternoon. The exhibition comprises works by artists listed in Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner's address books. Among the most significant for both Pollock and Krasner is Betty Parsons, whose gallery represented Pollock from 1948 to 1951 and gave Krasner her first solo show in 1951. No one is better qualified to discuss Betty Parsons' crucial role in championing avant-garde American art, as well as her parallel career as an artist, than independent curator and art consultant Anne Cohen DePietro. Anne served for many years as chief curator of the Heckscher Museum of Art in Huntington, Long Island, where she significantly enhanced the permanent collection and organized numerous important exhibitions, including Shaping a Generation, The Art and Artists of Betty Parsons in 1999. As director of the Heckscher's Newsday Center for Dove Tourist Studies, devoted to the life and work of the American modernists Arthur Dove and Helen Torr, Anne spearheaded research, documentation, and fundraising efforts for the Dove Tour Cottage in Centerport, Long Island, and remains a member of its advisory panel. Also for the Heckscher, she acquired the extensive archives of Esfir Slobodkina, a founding member of the American Abstract Artists, and she now serves on the board of the Slobodkina Foundation in Glen Head, New York. After leaving the Heckscher, she was director of Spanyaman Gallery in East Hampton, where she focused on the art and artists of Long Island, and spent 11 years as an American art specialist at Doyle Auctioneers in Manhattan. And her topic today is Betty Parsons in the Company of Friends. So please welcome Anne Cohen DePietro. Oh, let me also add, if you'd like to put questions and comments in the chat while she's speaking, please do that, because we'll open the Q&A after she's finished with her talk.
Okay, here we go. Share screen. Enter. Okay, slideshow, right? Okay, can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Okay, wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin with the formal lecture, I'd simply like to acknowledge Alexander Gray Associates, which represents the estate of Betty Parsons, and Hollis Taggart Galleries for assistance with images associated with this presentation. Also, images have also come from the Archives of American Art, and I am grateful, as always, to the Betty Parsons and William Rayner Foundation, which holds the copyright for Betty's work. Remarks by William Rayner, Edward Albee, Jack Tilton, Hedda Stern, and others come from interviews I conducted with them when curating Shaping a Generation, The Art and Artists of Betty Parsons for the Heckscher Museum of Art. And I should note that nearly all works by artists illustrated in this presentation, not including Betty's, were part of Betty's private collection. So to begin, a lifelong advocate of creative artists working in a wide range of media and styles, Betty Parsons provided unwavering support that transcended the traditional gallery relationship, forming personal friendships with artists that both preceded and outlasted their commercial ties to the Betty Parsons Gallery. In consequence of her personal and professional connections to the wide range of artists with whose paths she crossed, in a life devoted to finding the creative note, she established a substantial personal collection comprising more than 1,000 objects by the time of her death in 1982. These were acquired through purchase, by gift, and even by exchange of some of her own paintings for those of her peers. Some in Betty's stable were aware that she was one of them, and not only an art dealer. Among this group was Jackson Pollock, who was said to have admired her work. Until late in life, she thought it unseemly to show her paintings at her eponymous gallery, instead exhibiting for more than 20 years at the Midtown Gallery and at a few other venues when opportunity arose. Working unceasingly on her own art, Parsons created a prodigious body of work on paper, always carrying sketchbooks, watercolors, crayons, and in later years, marking pens and her journals in a little basket that accompanied her at home and abroad, and that appears in a photo of her taken on the beach in Southold at left. She churned out watercolors on board trains, on transatlantic flights, and in the back seats of cars, haphazardly jotting notes, shopping lists, or lines of verse. As an example, art is a lightning flash of harmony alongside her sketches. With boundless energy, in the later 1940s, she turned to abstractions in oil, in which she sought to convey her sense of excitement about what she termed the expanding world. In her 60s, she adopted the medium for which she now may be best known. Whimsical, vibrantly painted constructions. She assembled them at her weekend home and studio on Long Island's North Fork, using scraps of wood that washed ashore on the beach in front of her studio that she called carpenter's throwaways. Painting them in brilliant hues, Betty enlisted the help of friends and house guests to hammer the parts together into compositions that evolved without preconception. Titles, often elusive to the East End, were chosen after completion. The image at right shows Betty sitting on the floor of her studio. In 1998, the choreographer and friend, Paul Taylor, a neighbor in Mattituck, reminisced. Betty had a place on the North Fork of Long Island, not far from mine. I used to take her carloads of boards and stuff that had washed up on my beach. Old beat-up boards that had already been painted several times. Those were the kind she liked best. She would study their possibilities, nail them together, and add stripes or whatever. She gave me one, which I admire greatly and wouldn't part with for anything. You might say it represents mutual respect, is an emblem of an abiding friendship. Betty Byrne Pearson was born in late January 1900, at the turn of the 20th century, to a patrician family with deep historic ties to Long Island. In the fall of 1640, her ancestor, Abraham Pearson, arrived in Southampton to serve as its first minister. Her privileged childhood included a cursory 5-year stint at Miss Chapin's school in New York. Many of her fellow classmates there would become lifelong friends and supporters.
And is there a slide of her as a child?
I've got it coming.
Okay. There we go.
Okay. A disinterested student, her penmanship was messy, her spelling inaccurate and wildly creative, traits that she proudly retained throughout her life. A visit to the 1913 Armory Show was life-changing. Surrounded by avant-garde art and thrilling to the excitement, the 13-year-old, seen in the photo at right, was drawn to the idealized forms of Antoine Bourdelle, and she instantly resolved to become a sculptor. Taking the show's motto, "The New Spirit," which you see in the pin on this slide, as her own. By 1919, she was on the marriage market, landing a proposal from Schuyler Livingston Parsons, from one of New York's most prominent families. The couple married in 1920, dividing their time between a Manhattan apartment and a residence in Islip on Long Island's South Shore. The relationship was an unhappy one and was for Betty stultifying. Escaping to Paris and divorced by the age of 24, Betty's life began in earnest as she immersed herself in the heady artistic and social life of American expatriates abroad between the wars. She painted next to Alberto Giacometti and met Man Ray and Gertrude Stein. Alexander Calder, seen at upper right, became a dance partner and lifelong friend, a frequent dinner guest. In gratitude, he made her a wire toilet paper holder that, to her regret, was stolen. An example that you see at lower right is owned by the Calder Foundation. Liberated by the more sexually permissive atmosphere in Paris, she met, fell in love with, and set up housekeeping with a British painter, Adge Baker, purchasing a home in Montparnasse. Enrolling at the Académie Chaumière, she studied with Antoine Bourdelle, who you see at upper left, and she took private classes with Ossip Zadkine at lower left. Over summers, she studied with the British watercolorist Arthur Lindsay, and there at center you see at left, Adge Baker, and a little harder to see, Betty to her right. At the upper left in this slide is untitled male figure from the early 1920s. Bourdelle admired the primitive vigor of her forms in works such as this. While in France, Betty began what became a lifelong practice of sketching constantly, recording quick impressions of daily events and incessant travel. The watercolor of Aix-en-Provence at lower left from 1927 is executed with characteristic spontaneity and spirit. Disinherited by her family upon divorcing, Betty was supported in France by alimony from her ex-husband. Unaware of the disastrous consequences of the crash of 29 until her alimony payment stopped, in July 1933, she set sail for home with the aid of funds wired by a childhood friend. After 2 years eking out a living teaching portrait painting and consulting on wine in California, she returned to New York in late 1935 at the behest of a wealthy beau who intended to marry her. Valuing her independence more than a marriage that would have afforded financial stability, Parsons declined the offer. Exhibited in France at the Galerie des Quatre Chemins, a body of her French watercolors had been praised in 1933 by a Herald Tribune critic for a vibrant quality of life and personality. Introduced upon her arrival in New York to Alan Ruskin of Midtown Galleries, she was offered an exhibition the following month of those same French watercolors, augmented by California scenes. The show was a sellout. Noting the well-heeled friends buying her paintings, Ruskin offered her a job selling art. Betty started down the path she followed for the rest of her life, promoting and selling the work of contemporary artists in her day job and painting on evenings and weekends. A second exhibition at Midtown in 1936, featuring watercolors of Smithtown, Southampton, and Sag Harbor, was again a success. Over a period of more than 20 years, Midtown Galleries gave her 10 exhibitions. Here you see at upper right, Celeste Beach, Acapulco, Mexico from 1940, and Rockport at lower right from 1943. As a guest essayist in 1999, for Shaping a Generation, the Art and Artists of Betty Parsons, Helen Harrison wrote, like many of her contemporaries, Parsons began as a representational painter, firmly grounding her art in firsthand observation and subjective response to personal experience. Far from limiting her vision, however, that approach opened a world of possibilities for eventual exploitation in abstract terms. As she progressed along the path of artistic maturity, her development paralleled that of many of the painters and sculptors who are now regarded as America's most important abstractionists. Wherever she lived, Parsons made friends easily and enjoyed an active social life. People loved her enthusiasm in diverse interests and her passion for travel and art. She was good company. Like the address books owned by Jackson and Lee that inspired creative exchanges, 3 of Betty's at the Archives of American Art disclose an extensive acquaintance in which professional and personal lives are inextricably entwined. Together with her daily journals and sketchbooks, they are filled with the names of artists, friends from high society, art dealers, curators, hotels across the globe, restaurants, and more. Here with a few examples. At upper left, the famed curator Alfred Barr's home phone number, which Jackson and Lee also had in their address book. At lower left, Osip Zadkin's Parisian address. At lower center, the addresses of restaurants abroad, worldwide with commentary. A listing for the London restaurant Mr. Chow is accompanied by a tart, the expensive. A newspaper notice creeps in from one of Betty's watercolor exhibitions at Midtown Galleries. And there is at the top a list, top right, a list of birthdays that includes friends, lovers past and present, her beloved nephew Billy Rayner, and Barnett Newman, an ally with whom she socialized, visited museums, and shared an interest in ancient and primitive art. As stints at other galleries followed, first in 1937 with Mrs. Cornelia Sullivan, who was the founder of the Museum of Modern Art, and then in 1940 at the Wakefield Bookshop, Betty honed her skills as a dealer. Here you see at center a view of the Wakefield. Betty ran her gallery in a room at the back. We have also a number of portraits of Betty made by her friends. I show you a few of them here. Two of them, Saul Steinberg and Hedda Stern, showed with her at Wakefield in 1943. At top right, you have Saul Steinberg's caricatured self-portrait of an kissing Parsons as a dog, celebrating her 75th birthday, while a profile study of a nude Betty by Hedda Stern, dating back to 1935, that's at lower right, testifies to their long acquaintance. At left is a painted portrait by Henry Schnackenberg, a friend for years, who wrote sensitively about her work. The addresses for all three, all eventually backers of her eponymous gallery, appear in the address book below at lower left. Developing her own roster of artists, many of whom remained with her at future venues, she put the Wakefield on the map, giving one-person shows to Alfonso Osorio in 1941. You see his assemblage from 1964 at upper left. Adolf Gottlieb, untitled 1942 at top center, and Theodoros in Osorio in 1941, Gottlieb and Theodoros Stamos in 1944. You see Retinue in 1946. I apologize for the black and white image. It's the only one I could find. She developed a reputation as someone with a prescient ability to identify new talent, something she attributed to her own innate abilities as an artist. Both Osorio and Stamos began showing with Parsons early and remained with her for years. Gottlieb, in comparison, received only one single one-man show in 1944. At the same time, she began to collect with limited resources, focusing predominantly on the artists in her stable. Things often came to her by exchange or gift. Hedda Stern said people loved Betty, and they wanted to share with her works that they had made. When an artist's work did not sell well, she would occasionally buy a modest example as a sort of consolation prize, as was the case with Paul Feely. In 1968, on the occasion of an exhibition of a portion of her collection at the Finch College Museum of Art, Rosalind Constable wrote in Art News, "It is probable that never was such a valuable art collection put together with such a small cash outlay." With the closure of the bookshop in 1944, Betty was invited by Mortimer Brandt to show contemporary art in one section of his gallery, which to this point had focused exclusively on old masters. There she showed John Graham, Walter Murch, Ed Reinhardt, Mark Rothko, and Hans Hofmann, among others. At center, you have Toreador by Graham in 1943, and Still Life with Pomegranate from 1945 by Walter Murch is at lower right. When Brandt decided to return to his native England in September 1946, Parsons launched her own gallery in his former space, and with a nest egg of $5,500 that included $1,000 of her personal savings, as well as loans from two wealthy friends and support from Hedda Stern, Saul Steinberg, and Henry Schnackenberg. The latter a supporter of her new endeavor, even though his own work, which you saw previously, wasn't compatible with that of the artists in her roster. Her first exhibition featured Northwest Coast Indian art. Barney Newman contributed a catalog essay. Like Betty, he found parallels in the work and spiritual ethos of ancient and pre-literate artists and modern art. With the opening of the Betty Parsons Gallery in September 1946, Betty's life settled into a routine that included work at the gallery from Monday through Thursday. On Friday, she left Manhattan at breakneck speed and without benefit of driver's license to get to the small rental cottage in Southold that she shared with her lover, actress and painter, Strelsa von Screever. Weekends and summers when the gallery was closed afforded her more time to paint. Around that time, Newman brought her out to the Springs, introducing her to Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner. Betty later recalled, "The weekend I met Jackson Pollock, he wanted to make a drawing for me. You see it at lower right, to the extreme right. We sat on the floor and he had his inks and pens. He broke about 3 pens, and I still have what he did, the orchestra of the insects." Quite a few of Betty's artists through the years spent part of their time in East Hampton and its environs, including Newman, Rothko, Osorio, Stern, Motherwell, and more. Some of them followed Jackson and Lee, who had arrived in the Springs in 1945 with the financial aid of Peggy Guggenheim. Like Parsons, Stamos lived in the North Fork in East Marion. Exhibiting her collection of avant-garde European art at her New York gallery, Art of the Century, over time, Guggenheim had expanded her vision to include the work of a group of young American painters, including Clyfford Still, Pollock, Rothko, and Newman. When she decided to close her gallery to move to Venice in 1947, she formally transferred her stable to Betty Parsons, who she knew professionally and who she respected. Betty called them her Four Horsemen, first exhibiting Still's work in the spring of 1947, Pollock's in 1948, and Newman's in 1950. She had already shown Rothko's before opening the Betty Parsons Gallery while she was still working for Mortimer Brandt. Betty's private collection included Jackson Pollock, number 12A, Yellow, Gray, Black from 1948 at upper left. To its right, Mark Rothko, number 9 from 1946. To the lower right, next to it, Barnett Newman Concord from 1949. That's owned by the Metropolitan now. Above that is a famous image of Betty and Barnett Newman with one of his zip paintings. And then at the extreme right, Clyfford Still from 1951, number 3. These giants of abstract expressionism remained with the Parsons Gallery for a mere few years. Betty refused their demand to abandon the rest of her stable for Pollock, Rothko, Still, and Newman. Her selling style, not particularly aggressive, she conducted business with politesse. Disappointed with the lack of sales, artists came and left regularly. Her four horsemen departed for Sidney Janis. Having made them famous, if not financially successful, her search for the new continued. The Parsons Gallery was notable for putting abstract expressionism on the map. It was notable as well for the number of women artists who exhibited there. Long overdue attention has been and continues to be paid to the work of many women working within the abex idiom. Herewith, I mention just a few. As Helen mentioned, Betty gave Lee Krasner, you see here Color Totem from 1955, her first one solo show in 1951. Receiving mixed reviews, Lee retired the 14 pieces exhibited to her studio, eventually using components of these abandoned works and other compositions. At top center, you see Windows by Hedda Stern from 1945. A dear friend of long standing, Hedda Stern exhibited with Betty longer than almost any other artist. She received 2 solo shows at Mortimer Brandt and 11 at the Betty Parsons Gallery between 1947 and 1968. At upper right is Antigone II from 1958 by Ethel Schwabacher, who met Betty around 1951 and who received 5 solo exhibitions at the gallery between 1953 and 1962. When Schwabacher's subject matter turned to social issues, Parsons no longer exhibited her work, but their friendship remained. At lower center, Agnes Martin's Bones 2. Agnes came to New York City from New Mexico at Betty's behest. A single show of her work was held in 1961 before their business and personal relationships abruptly terminated. Immersed as Parsons was in the fecund environment shared by seminal figures of abstract expressionism, it is hardly surprising that she too began to explore new avenues of painting. Through the mid-1940s, she had worked in a broadly representational style with expressionist overtones, notable for an edgy linear quality. She was often praised for her sense of color, an element that remained central to her art. In 1938, Schnackenberg wrote the foreword to an exhibition of her work at the Syracuse Museum of Fine Arts. Primarily, one senses in the best of the watercolors and oils of Betty Parsons a great excitement with color for its own sake, to which form, as a quality in itself, must give precedence. Here is a dance of shapes and rhythms, of lights and darks, but above all, an extreme activity of color. But in spite of their seeming preoccupation with the more purely aesthetic abstractions of color and active forms, these paintings have a really unusual character of place. They are unmistakably in the tempo of the present, painted by an artist with a quick and nervously sensitive reaction to the world about her. In 1947, recuperating from a serious illness and visiting friends in California, Parsons found that her usual style was unequal to the task at hand. Attending a day-long rodeo, she was overwhelmed by the noise, dust, and heat. The excitement and emotions were impossible for her to capture and paint. She recalled, "I just couldn't get it down. There was too much, and everything came from everywhere. Colors, noise, horses, cowboys, cowgirls, Indians, little cows and big cows. It was sheer energy." Later in the day, translating these sensations into watercolors, she found that she was painting abstractly. Her host passed by and asked what she was doing, and she responded, "It's feeling, it's energy, it's the expanding world." The transition in her work as compared to Celeste Beach from 1940 at upper left is dramatic when compared to The Circle of 1947 at lower left. its geometric and irregular forms positioned haphazardly in a palette dominated by pink and teal hues. By 1950, as you see in Untitled at upper right, Parsons abandons pictorial depth, adopting geometric lozenge shapes that float against green forms outlined in blue. The lozenges, as well as graffito-like marks seen here, achieved by using the butt end of a brush, appear frequently in paintings and works on paper from this era that also display her skill as a colorist. Through the years, Betty easily moved back and forth between abstraction and representation, particularly in watercolors documenting her travels. Palace at lower right from 1953 is likely one of these, incorporating as it does a section of crenellated wall squarely within an otherwise abstract piece. Sales of her paintings during the 1940s and 50s were disheartening. Only 11 were sold between 1941 and 1955. 3 of them to artists who were also personal friends, including Osorio, Schnackenberg, and Kimi Okada, the wife of Kenzo Okada, from Betty's stable. A 4th was bought by Duncan Phillips. In March 1954, she received the happy news that her watercolor Agamemnon was selected for inclusion in the annual juried show of the Society of the Four Arts in Florida. That July, she wrote to Seymour Lipton, "I intend to stay in Biloxi for another week, have been painting large canvases." Biloxi was the home of Dusty Bonget, one of Betty's artists, as well as a friend and travel companion. It is conceivable that Betty was referring to Tropical at upper left, a lush painting capturing the oppressive heat and luxuriant foliage of a Mississippi summer. It might also describe the landscape of Mexico, which Dusty and Betty visited together the same year, and you see them during that trip to the right of Tropical. To the extreme right is Dusty's Portrait of B from 1955, an acknowledgement of their professional and personal friendships, now owned by the National Museum of Women in the Arts. This slide also shows at bottom center from 1958, Untitled, a particularly lyrical work and an unusual one of Betty's that was owned personally by Dusty, and it reminds me a great deal of Tropical. And to the extreme left at bottom, I couldn't resist, is Betty's address book with Dusty's phone number and address in Biloxi. Okay, at left you see Gulf of Mexico from 1951, one of my favorite works by Parsons. The palette and composition are complex, with the central form filled with her typical lozenge shapes in blue, orange, and black. Blue, orange, and Betty's signature green that appear to float in the sea of blue. Irregular shards of black, orange, and ochre form the perimeter. Beginning in the 1950s, she begins to diversify her approach. Agitated surfaces diminish, and forms are masked more simply. Color remains one of her most effective tools, and she consciously manipulates it to infuse her canvases with light. There are a few clues to the choice of title in Southold at upper center from 1952, though the palette of rich green and brown, together with the rectilinear forms employed, may reference the verdant potato fields of the undeveloped North Fork of the 1950s. Undersea number 2 at upper right from 1956 is a real beauty comprised of a triad of colors with abstracted shapes devoid of meaning against a flat blue ground. At lower center, Untitled from roughly the same period, these are both gouaches, incidentally, shares a similarly spare palette, simple forms juxtaposed against a luminous blue. At lower right, the somber End of Winter from 1958-9 is painted in a darker palette, which is not uncommon in work by Betty from this period, the late 50s. Hastily executed, as Betty's paintings so often were, the quick brushwork leaves slivers of white background exposed. Drawing inspiration from her natural surroundings, she habitually stood in front of an unstretched canvas, cut to size and stapled to a wall, following a process she described in a 1968 interview with Lawrence Alloway. When I start painting a picture, I try to become blank and only let an emotion come into me. If I say, for instance, I have an idea that I want to paint an atmosphere that I see out of the window, I try to become a blank when it comes to choice of the forms and the colors. I pick out a gray or brown or whatever the atmosphere is, and I put it down very spontaneously. That color introduces an idea for another color, either to enhance it or make it more intense, and I go on from there. Once asked if she was influenced in her painting by any artists, the work of Clyfford Still comes to mind as one example. Betty said that she possessed a remarkable ability all her life to forget everything. Thus, it was impossible for that to occur. In 1959, an unanticipated modest bequest from an uncle enabled Parsons to commission Tony Smith, an architect and sculptor who showed at her gallery, to design a studio for her at the top of a cliff in Southold, not far from Horton's Point Lighthouse, with majestic views of Long Island Sound. Completed the following year, it offered Betty a refuge where she could paint in peace. This slide shows Betty painting in the studio at lower right. There are two views of the facade of the building. There is a scale model, a shot of the interior at upper right. These photos from the Archives of American Art show Parsons and Smith 2 years later laying out the envelope for a guest house that was added. When I interviewed him in 1999, Billy Rayner recalled that his aunt, quote, chose the wild side of Long Island to live on. She never wanted to come to the Hamptons. She really wanted to live on the wilder shore. Jack Youngerman, a Bridgehampton resident, said, Betty moved to the North Fork to get away from the socializing on the South Fork. Even in her 70s, she swam nude. She was a free soul. A sense of contentment creeps into her paintings. Untitled, from 1962 at left, is one of her most tranquil expressions. Translucent orange, blue, and green shapes, fluid descendants of her lozenges from a decade earlier, float against cream ground. In Midsummer at Center, from 1965, the muggy heat of a summer's day is palpable, but slivers of blue provide cooling relief. At right, Winter Southold captures the geometry of barren winter fields and bands of snow. Descending a steep flight of stairs from her studio, Betty walked along her beach, picking up small round stones. She began painting concentric circles and other forms on them, sometimes giving them away as tokens of friendship. The Pollock Krasner house owns 2 of these, a gift to Lee Krasner on the occasion of a visit. When Jack Youngerman visited Betty at her summer home in the mid-1960s, moved by what he perceived to be her extreme modesty with regard to her own work, he suggested that she take those same forms and use them on a larger scale. I show you at lower left, Youngerman's own painting, East, 1960, from Betty's collection. Stripes, concentric geometric forms, and rhythmic patterns began to populate paintings, such as 4th of July from 1964 at Upper Center, and Clocks of Time, 1968, at far right. In a 1975 interview, Parsons conceded that the latter work may have been inspired by her painted beach stones. She added, "Clocks of Time really came out of a feeling of different kinds of time, of nighttime, of daytime. There's short time, there's long time. There's ancient times, contemporary time, all the times. It was a very spontaneous process." The same spontaneity informs Betty's constructions made with flotsam and jetsam that washed onto her beach. Unlike traditional driftwood, it was the discarded bits of lumber, broken furniture, worn shop signs, and architectural fragments that bore traces of former lives, what she called carpenter's throwaways, that inspired her to fulfill her youthful aspiration to sculpt. These objects, created in the spirit of objets trouvés, constitute Parsons' final and perhaps most significant body of work. She began by painting individual pieces in bright acrylic colors, adding stripes and other decoration. Where she found traces of original paint, she retained them, together with any lingering nails or hardware. She assembled the segments in combinations that she felt were dictated by the parts themselves, shifting them around until she felt it was right. Trusting in the laws of chance and using Elmer's glue and small metal brads, she created fanciful constructions evocative of folk art, primitive sculpture, and the ready-mades of Marcel Duchamp that he described as everyday objects raised to the dignity of a work of art by the artist's act of choice. The witty titles she chose for them reflected her innate poetic sensibility. They also, as observed by Roy Nicholson, hook you into the Long Island environment. These were serious works that merited serious consideration. When shown in a major retrospective at the Montclair Art Museum in 1974, that included the painting Clocks of Time that you saw previously, Paul Perot wrote of her constructions, "The pleasure is the non-whimsical result of a flirtation with whimsy." Here you see Betty working at her sculptures in her studio, surrounded by the flotsam and jetsam, particularly in the lower right image, the lower image at lower right. The titles are particularly elusive to her North Fork home. At upper right, Tugboat Lighthouse from 1970. At center, One-Eyed Lighthouse from 1971. And finally, Sound Melody from 1977, evoking the sound of the sea and its rhythmic quality. And here you can see traces of the original flaking paint surface in the blue section at center, which are left untouched. All of Betty's friends knew of her new passion. Edward Albee and his partner, Jonathan Thomas, recalled visiting Betty in Southold, as well as her winter home in St. Martin. Jonathan shared, "That woman was always working, and she always had her paints. It was constant work, always something going on, and she would have everybody involved too. I mean, in St. Martin, Paul Taylor would be down on the beach picking up wood. Jasper Johns would pick up wood for her. All these people would say, 'Oh, you'd better take this back for Betty.'" Albee added, "And it was kind of, if Betty doesn't want it, then Louise will." Dusty Bonger even shipped her what she described as a hunk of wood that she found on the beach in Gulfport, Mississippi, notifying her by the postcard that you see at lower left that it was en route. Betty regularly enlisted the aid of gallery assistants and house guests in Southold to more securely fasten the works. As seen in the photo at left, in her basement, she had a work surface set up on sawhorses on which she combined the elements of a sculpture. The late gallerist Jack Tilton said that she could, quote, she could hammer, but usually they wouldn't hold together as well. She often had an artist nail them together. Tuttle would come, and there was this whole idea of collaboration. That was part of the artwork. You could tell if Tuttle had done it, or Arthur Pearson, or myself, or Gwyn Metz. We all nailed them together, but each took on a slightly different character. Tuttle swore that she painted them a little bit differently, depending on who was putting them together. To the right of let's see. I've lost it. Okay. To the right of the photo of Betty working in the basement, Totem Materia R from 1980, and to its right, Blocks from 1975, and Look Up at Lower Center are among her more complex works, each comprised of numerous blocks of painted wood. At times, she chose titles suggestive of the primal cultures that interested her, but others describe buccaneers and Indians. To the right in this slide are two works, Yield at top and No Passing, allusive to traffic signs. Visitors to Southold who rode out east with Betty behind the wheel said they were taking their lives in her hands. She drove as she did everything else, throwing caution to the winds. In the mid-1970s, following a trip to Africa with her nephew William Rayner, Parsons adopted an even more brilliant palette. Repetitive striped forms, possibly inspired by her constructions, become a frequent motif in canvases, such as the contemplative Fog in the Sea, 1976, at top center, that had been owned by Edward Albee. Several similarly striped objects awash in a field of blue closely resemble her fish constructions, such as the example that you see at far right, that she made and gave to friends as talismans. Former assistants remember being asked to hold pieces of wood against a canvas so Betty could outline their forms. As is true of so many of her Southold subjects, Fog in the Sea captures the essence of the East End and its historic ties to seafaring and fishing, a way of life dependent upon the vagaries of weather. Here are photos of Betty taking tea, looking at her extraordinary view of the Sound, and at lower center standing in her studio. Striped forms, now green with orangey pink striations, appear once more in Journey, 1975 at lower left. The painting is notable for a sophisticated palette reminiscent of tribal fabrics, with brilliant blues juxtaposed against hot pinks and an expanse of warm brown edged with vivid purple. The untitled work at lower right from 1981 relates compositionally to the winter Southold in the somber palette that I had shown you earlier, but it replaces those sober hues with bands of candy cane color reminiscent of the constructions that dominate her last years. Driving to Southold every weekend without fail, Betty often brought house guests who adhered to a strict schedule determined by their host, including time set aside for making art. Her constructions peopled her world, arrayed on shelves and strewn across tabletops. Late examples include the delightful Flying Duck from 1981 at left, incorporating a fragment of long abandoned license plate and allusive to the long history of duck farming on the North Fork. Flight, upper center, appears to be equal fish and rocket ship. And in the Jester at lower center, made from a washed up section of ladder, discarded jigsawed scraps of wood scramble up the rungs. Carpenter's throwaways indeed. At the extreme right, Betty composes a construction outside. Of her later works, The Eyes of the Sea at upper left and Sailing Through the Sound at lower right from 1982 are among her most poetic. With titles reflective of her love of her studio by the Sound, they are decorated with her signature stripes. The one resembling some fantastic sea creature with a dorsal fin and multiple eyes, the other portraying a cubistic sailboat They're magical. Out of serendipity came compelling totemic constructions, often revealing an affinity to the ancient art that she loved, but also, and more significantly, to the North Fork of Long Island, where she found the inspiration and materials to achieve her lifelong goal, to sculpt. Betty Parsons suffered a fatal stroke in Southold in July 1982. Her ashes were scattered on Long Island Sound, and a bronze plaque with her name was mounted on a large boulder at the base of her staircase to the sea. Of her work, Alloway, a close friend and frequent visitor with his wife Sylvia Slay, wrote, "Her imagery is persistently evocative of nature, not in terms of specific topography, but as effects of light and color, the seasons or the sky. She is cued by the color wherever she finds herself, by an evening sky, a flowering tree, a rock, plumage, and these remain, within the format of abstract art, the basis of her work. Hers is an associative abstract art, not sealed off from nature by a canon of concreteness, but infiltrated by roots, lit by the sun, and washed by the sea." Thank you. Okay, stop share. There. Helen,
There I am.
there you are.
Thank you
Okay.
so much, Anne. I just so excited to see the variety of work that she did. I thought I really knew her, Irv, but you've opened a new window on it for me. And I see we've got a couple of questions in the chat from Linda. One is, do you know any more quotes from Betty about her state of mind when she started work, in addition to, quote, "I try to become a blank"?
She, offhand, I think the best source for quotes is Lee Hall's book, The Biography of Betty Parsons. There are some, but I think that is really the most telling.
And then the other question is, Elmer's glue does not have a reputation for being strong and permanent. Did Betty's work have any problems with permanent?
Oh yeah. If she did not, Gwynne Metz was Betty's assistant at the gallery and a friend and travel companion, and she said Betty couldn't hammer a nail. She was not technically proficient. Oftentimes, if she didn't have someone helping her, they were very unsturdy and wobbly. And it's really why she turned so much to her friends, particularly her galleries, artists and staff, the young people who visited her. She would sometimes put plywood as a backing, but Jack Tilton said that which I think I mentioned, that he felt that the work changed character in a way, in subtle ways, depending on who was helping her make the piece. So he wanted in particular to make them sturdier so that they could travel safely. Others tried to respect the integrity of her aesthetic vision and wanted the depth to be just what she wanted it to be, and the configuration, and those were somewhat less stable. But yeah, Elmer's glue isn't great.
But I think that from the point of view of longevity, obviously, if something came loose, or if it needed to be fixed, that wouldn't really disturb the aesthetics of it, as long as it wasn't visible. You could put it, in other words, you could put a screw in and hold it together, or you could put a different kind of glue and it would still be the same sculpture.
Betty was really somewhat casual about assembling these things. It was the process, it was the vision, it was her desire to express her expanding world, her sense of the expanding world, that interested her. And I don't think she was thinking of longevity. But
hi, can you hear me? This is Bobby Kohler. It's so nice to see you. And
how are you?
I'm good. So I just want to say I am the very fortunate owner of Yield, which you just showed in this talk. And I just went to look at the back of it, which I don't usually do. And just to add something to the technical aspect of how it's put together. So it has wood slats, both horizontal and vertical, and very obvious nails. It was nailed in the front too. So mine, I hope will last. I don't think the Elmer's glue is keeping it together, but just what you described is what I have. And it, I don't know, it adds to the spontaneous and to the, you know, put together
Sure.
collage effect by having very obvious nails. And
Well,
thank you for this wonderful talk.
You're very lucky. I would love to have a Betty Parsons.
I know. Thank you.
If
Thank you.
anybody else has any questions or comments, please unmute yourselves. Go right ahead, or put them in the chat if you prefer to do that. One thing I did want to ask you, you mentioned that all of the artwork by others that you showed were from her collection.
Correct.
Are many of those things now in museums, or do we know what happened to them?
We don't always know. I had access online to an exhibition catalog of her collection shown at the Finch College Museum of Art, which was helpful in identifying works. And then there was also the Christie's sale of the more stellar works from her collection. The Betty Parsons Foundation gave away quite a few of items from her collection. I think the most sensational pieces sold at auction, but they were also giving some to museums immediately before her death and in the years following. So some I was able to find. I was not able to find the Theodora Stamos or Windows by Hedda Stern, and nor could I find a color image of them.
So those images came from the catalog, right?
Indeed. But for example, the Wadsworth Athenaeum, which owns Ethel Schwabacher's Antigone, which I showed, received, I think, 12 or 15 works from the Betty Parsons Foundation. So at one point they were giving away significant blocks of work to institutions. So the foundation, I'm sure, has records as to where everything went. And they've always been.
Oh, sorry. I remember seeing the Pollock, the yellow and black Pollock in the ABEX show in London at the Royal Academy about 5 years ago. I don't remember what collection it came from, but that one is out there.
No, a lot of things were bought out of the Christie's sale, and I think went to galleries. I forget whose work it was, but it had passed from one gallerist to another, to a private collector. It was between when the sale was held and the time it came up next at auctions. There was a chain of maybe 6 owners.
Wow.
So these things have moved around and have gone up tremendously in value, of course, from the years from the date of the Christie sale to the present time.
James Evans had a question. I missed if you said when her gallery closed.
After Betty's death, her friends and family decided to keep it open for 1 more year. And I think at the end, I believe the final exhibition or a memorial exhibition, now I can't remember correctly, was a show of artists who had shown with her through the years, but I believe it closed in 1983.
But then Jack Tilton took it over, didn't he? Or did he take over her stable? Or?
He took over her space.
Oh, okay.
He had begun as an assistant, maybe in the 60s, and then he opened the Jack Tilton Gallery, but I don't know how many of her stable which was always a rather fluid entity anyway. People would come and go, how many he took over. He passed away a few years ago. Oddly, when I lived in the city, turned out he lived in my building. And I found my apartment without realizing he lived there. He was a nice man and very helpful.
Are there any other questions
Anything
or
else?
comments? Please feel free to unmute yourselves and hold forth. Okay, then I will say thank you again to Anne, a dear friend of longstanding, for being so willing to share her insights into Betty's work. And I hope you'll all be back next week when I will be holding forth on the artists of the Springs, people in Jackson and Lee's circle, and those from more recent generations as well. So I hope we will see you all then. Thank you again, and good evening, everyone.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me, Helen.
You're most welcome.